It's a warm afternoon, and you might picture yourself sitting in a cozy living room, flipping through old black and white photographs of Hollywood's golden years. The face that appears is unforgettable: high cheekbones, sparkling eyes, and a kind of bold confidence that instantly suggests stardom. This is Barbara Payton at the height of her beauty. She's smiling on the set of a film that's long since become a rare gem in classic cinema. Yet behind that dazzling smile, there's a mystery and a heartbreak that many in Hollywood never knew, or perhaps chose to forget. Today we'll unlock those memories and unravel the journey of a woman once declared the most beautiful girl in pictures, whose life proves just how high Hollywood's lights can shine and how unforgiving the shadows can be when fortune fades. To understand the heart of this paradox, we need to start at the very beginning. Back in 1927, in a small town called Cloquet, Minnesota, it was there, on November 16th of that year, that Barbara Lee Redfield was born into a family of Norwegian descent. Her father, Erwin Lee Flip Redfield, was a charming man who, as some accounts have suggested, had a habit of relying on wit and business opportunities just enough to get by. Her mother, Mabel Irene Todal, did her best to hold the family together. Growing up with 5 siblings was never easy. Money was tight, tempers often ran high, and there was a fair share of tension triggered by her parents' bouts with alcohol. No matter how many hopeful dreams the children had, there always seemed to be that lingering sense of chaos in the background. In 1938, when Barbara was still a girl, the family picked up and moved to Odessa, Texas, looking for a better life. Her father tried his hand at running a small tourist cabin business there, nothing lavish, but it paid the bills for a while. The dusty landscapes of West Texas were a far cry from the lush greenery of Minnesota. But for young Barbara, it was a chance to see a different slice of America. She watched travelers come and go, listened to stories from distant states, and developed a big curiosity about people and the wider world. And though she rarely showed it openly, she carried within her that universal hope so many small-town kids have, to someday do something big and meaningful, to break free of whatever pain she experienced at home. But it wouldn't be long before a dramatic turn in her life took place. At the age of 16, still practically a child, Barbara eloped with her high school sweetheart, William Hodge. It was the kind of youthful, spontaneous decision that's not uncommon among teenagers longing for love and a sense of adventure. Unsurprisingly, it didn't last. The marriage was annulled as quickly as it came to be. Embarrassment swirled, but Barbara was nothing if not determined. She picked herself up and by 1945 found herself walking down the aisle once again, this time with Air Force pilot John Payton. The newlyweds soon welcomed a son, John Lee, born in 1947, a bright spot in Barbara's life that she always cherished, no matter how rocky times got. Even so, the marriage was strained. After the war, countless service members moved to California, lured by new opportunities and that fabled California sunshine. Barbara and John followed the herd west, settling in Los Angeles. Not long after the disagreement started, the tension flared, and in 1948 they decided to separate. 2 years later, the divorce was finalized. For Barbara, though, there was an upside to the City of Angels. She discovered that her tall, sultry looks and captivating presence turned heads wherever she went. People started telling her she had what it took to be a model, maybe even a movie star. Encouraged by the compliments and the prospect of a more glamorous future, she threw herself headlong into modeling gigs, doing photo shoots, screen tests, anything to get a foot in Hollywood's imposing door. By 1949, her ambition began to bear fruit. Universal Studios, always on the lookout for fresh faces, noticed Barbara's potential and offered her a contract. Imagine the thrill for a young woman whose early years were full of strife. She was stepping onto those iconic lots, walking among sets where so many stars had strolled before her. It was a dream, but also a challenge. Hollywood wasn't a place for the faint of heart. It was a fiercely competitive industry that swallowed hopefuls by the dozen. Yet Barbara seemed to have an advantage. She was swiftly cast in a crime film titled Trapped, a noir thriller typical of the era, pulp fiction that drew in curious audiences with promises of suspense and intrigue. Though the movie itself didn't become a massive hit, it was enough to showcase Barbara's screen presence. People in the industry began to talk. This young actress had something, maybe not a polished technique, but a raw magnetism that played well on camera. That same year, she was given an even bigger chance alongside none other than James Cagney. In 1950, the film Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye hit theaters, and there was Barbara standing toe-to-toe with one of the most formidable talents of the day. She held her own, gritty, emotional, and undeniably alluring. Her performance was strong enough that she signed a contract with Cagney Productions. For an instant, it felt like Barbara was unstoppable. Magazine writers and Hollywood publicists started calling her the next big discovery, and the Hollywood Press Association even named her the most beautiful girl in pictures. In an era when studios controlled nearly every aspect of a starlet's image, that label was an invaluable boost. Yet, with the glare of the spotlight came the constant prying of tabloids. Hollywood fans devoured behind-the-scenes gossip, and Barbara's personal life was nothing if not sensational. She was rumored to have caught the eye of some of the most prominent men in the industry. Names like Howard Hughes and Bob Hope floated through the grapevine. Stories circulated about discreet rendezvous and lavish nights out, though it was often hard to parse fact from rumor. Still, Barbara's circle undeniably included big Hollywood players, people who could open or close career doors with a single recommendation or single complaint. Suddenly, everything she did carried weight, and it became a double-edged sword. As she juggled the newfound celebrity, her volatile personal life raged on. In 1951, she became engaged to Franchot Tone, an established actor who was as gentlemanly as they come. The news was a headline grabber. Here was a rising star and a well-known gentleman actor set to marry. But behind the scenes, Barbara had grown entranced by another man, Tom Neal, an actor known for a tough guy persona, both on and off screen. This wasn't just any fling, it was a scandalous, full-blown affair that played out in front of an eager tabloid press. When Tone found out, he confronted Neal, and an ugly brawl ensued. The result was devastating. Neal beat Tone so badly that Tone ended up in the hospital with significant injuries. For a while, it seemed uncertain whether Tone would pull through, but unbelievably, once he recovered, Barbara still married him. It was a whirlwind wedding that shocked Hollywood, and just about everyone watching asked the same question: why? Tensions were so high, and mistrust so deeply seated, that the marriage crumbled within months. If that had been the only scandal, perhaps Barbara's star might have survived. But she continued to be entangled in dramatic affairs and troubled relationships. The press had a field day. In an era where the Hollywood studio system demanded carefully orchestrated images of its leading ladies, wholesome, refined, respectable, Barbara was proving a nightmare for any publicist hoping to keep things tidy. By the mid-1950s, mainstream directors and producers grew wary. Her name was no longer a selling point, it was a caution sign. Though she still managed to land roles in B-movies like Bride of the Gorilla, 1951, and Murder is My Beat, 1955. They lacked the sparkle of her earlier promise. The budgets were smaller, the scripts less refined, and the same volatile personal reputation followed her wherever she went. In 1955, she married yet again, this time to George A. Tony Provus. That union lasted 3 years before ending in divorce in 1958. By now, Barbara was deeply entangled in a cycle of heartbreak, impulsive decisions, and increasing substance abuse. While some stars overcame personal turmoil by seeking help or stepping away from the limelight temporarily, Barbara seemed unable to pull herself out of the downward spiral. Alcohol dulled her pain, but also fueled further missteps. Hollywood's rumor mills, always hungry, circulated stories of her intoxication on set, her unpredictable moods, and her confessions of desperation. Gossip columnists relished every misfortune, adding a tinge of schadenfreude to their coverage, as though Hollywood needed a sacrificial lamb to remind everyone else of the industry's moral codes. Between 1955 and 1963, Barbara's life became a blur of police raids, drunken altercations, and public intoxication arrests. At one point, she faced charges related to prostitution. Nobody in the tabloids held back. Her mugshots appeared in newspapers, accompanied by sensational headlines that drove ticket-buying audiences further away. Casting agents kept their distance. Directors feared to associate their films with a star whose name spelled scandal rather than box office gold. Even close friends drifted off. She was a public cautionary tale, the starlet who had soared, then crashed. As her health deteriorated, the physical changes were just as shocking. The once radiant features that had dazzled on screen became gaunt, worn, and battered by substance abuse. Barbara was still in her 30s, but her body showed signs of advanced wear. Doctors cautioned her about her extreme drinking. Friends begged her to seek help, but attempts at rehabilitation were half-hearted, overshadowed by the unrelenting grip of addiction. In 1963, she published an autobiography with a bold title, I Am Not Ashamed. It was a brutally honest and, at times, heartbreaking read. If some in Hollywood had hoped to see Barbara retreat quietly into obscurity, they were sorely mistaken. Within those pages, she described the darkest corners of her life, her experiences with sex work, her numerous affairs, her battles with drugs and alcohol, and the sense of desperation that stalked her. It wasn't a glamorous recounting of high-flying Hollywood parties. It was raw, unvarnished, and deeply personal. Some critics derided the book as a mere publicity stunt, an attempt at shock value. Others read it with empathy, seeing a woman who, in many ways, had been out of her depth from the moment she set foot in Los Angeles. There is a telling passage in the autobiography where Barbara seemingly asks for forgiveness without self-pity. She acknowledges that no one forced her into that destructive lifestyle, but she had no real support system either. Her words, paraphrased, go something like, I came to Hollywood with wide eyes and found the world so much bigger, so much wilder than I'd ever known. I made choices, some good, some bad, and some that seem unforgivable. But if I could go back, would I change it? I can't say I would, because I learned something about what it means to be human. This confession, though overshadowed by negative press, struck a chord with certain readers who recognized a human being grappling with her demons. As the mid-1960s arrived, Hollywood had evolved, focusing on new stars, new trends, and new films that were pushing the boundaries of style and content. Barbara was all but forgotten in mainstream circles. She drifted between acquaintances, sometimes living on the margins, trying and failing to claw her way back to stable ground. But the consequences of her years of hard living could not be reversed. In 1967, she moved back in with her parents, who were then residing in San Diego. Her once fiery will to seek stardom had burned out, replaced by a frail figure barely clinging to life. In May of that year, at just 39 years old, Barbara died from heart and liver failure. The official cause told a story of prolonged alcohol and drug abuse. Her body simply couldn't withstand the punishment any longer. News of her death was greeted with muted reactions by the mainstream press. A few tabloids noted it with a touch of sensational tragedy. Barbara Payton, star-turned-scandal, dies at 39, read one headline. Old friends and colleagues felt a pang of sorrow, even those who'd cut ties with her for professional reasons. Many recognized that behind every wild headline, there had been a real, flesh-and-blood woman longing for acceptance and love. Years went by, and her memory faded in the public sphere, overshadowed by the next generation of Hollywood hopefuls. But for certain film buffs, her story remained endlessly intriguing. She had, after all, starred in a few memorable films, especially Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye with James Cagney, a movie that still draws curious viewers who see the flickering promise of a star who could have been so much more. Over time, people began to rediscover her autobiography, I Am Not Ashamed, which took on a cult status among fans of old Hollywood lore. Its candor struck a chord in more modern times, where personal memoirs detailing struggles with addiction and exploitation are given a more sympathetic reading. In the decades that followed, historians and biographers sought to piece together the puzzle of Barbara's life, her achievements, her misjudgments, and the social context that made her fall so public. John O'Dowd wrote, Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye, the Barbara Payton story, a comprehensive biography that dove even deeper into her background. He uncovered interviews, letters, and testimonies from people who were there during her heyday, revealing a woman of surprising complexity. She wasn't merely the scandal-plagued starlet. She was also at times heartbreakingly generous, especially to friends who had run out of money or found themselves without a roof. She could be warm and funny, the kind of person who could light up a room, and then just as suddenly she could self-destruct, lashing out or sinking into a despair fueled by the bottom of a bottle. One of her lesser-known qualities was a genuine affection for animals, especially stray cats. In her bleakest days, Barbara reportedly spent whatever small amount of money she could scrounge up to feed neighborhood cats who wandered outside her Los Angeles apartment. Neighbors would talk about how they'd see Barbara, barefoot and clad in a tattered robe, softly calling to the scruffy felines in the alleyway. She would gently pet them and share a bit of tuna or scraps of leftover chicken. While it was a quiet, almost unnoticed act, it offered a glimpse of her capacity for empathy. Even when her own life was unraveling, she could extend care to a creature in need. Though rarely discussed in mainstream retrospectives, that detail paints Barbara in a more humane light. It reminds us that behind every sensational headline, every mugshot, and cautionary tale, there's a human being with their own glimmers of kindness and love. It's easy for us, half a century later, to reduce her life to bullet points, the marriages, the affairs, the scandals, the dissent. But small anecdotes like the stray cat story hint that her life was never just one thing. Actors and actresses from her time rarely speak of her publicly now, given how many of them have passed on. But there was a period in the 1970s and 80s when a few who had known her or worked with her offered small insights in interviews. The sentiment was generally one of regret. They lamented that the studio system offered only limited support. Back then, if you had a problem with drinking or with relationships that spilled into scandal, the studios might hush it up for a while. But real support systems weren't really in place. And if your name became too risky, they'd stop calling altogether. That was the harsh business of showbiz. Open arms one minute, a closed door the next. One of the more touching stories about Barbara comes from an anecdote shared by an acquaintance who encountered her in a diner late one night. By this point in her life, Barbara's hardships were well known. According to this acquaintance, she saw Barbara sitting in a booth staring vacantly into a cup of coffee. She was visibly worn, a far cry from the glamour shots that once graced movie magazines. Still, when a lonely young waitress recognized Barbara and nervously approached her with a pen and a notepad, Barbara's face softened. She smiled gently and chatted with her for a good 10 minutes, asking about her own hopes and dreams, scribbling a short note of encouragement on a napkin. She told the waitress to keep believing in herself, that the world could still surprise you with good things, even if it's tough. Moments later, she paid the bill and disappeared into the night. Barbara's legacy is indeed complicated. On one hand, she's seen as an emblem of the darker side of Hollywood, a cautionary tale about how quickly success can slip away if you mix personal chaos with a relentless media spotlight. Her story underscores how precarious fame can be, especially if you're dealing with unresolved trauma or battling addiction. The Hollywood machine can catapult you to stardom, but it can also devour you the instant you step out of line or become unmanageable. On the other hand, Barbara's life also has a raw sincerity that modern audiences sometimes find refreshing. In a time when studio heads dictated everything from an actress's hairstyle to her public statements, Barbara broke molds simply by telling the truth, even if it was messy and painful. Her autobiography didn't try to spin a graceful redemption story. It spoke candidly, shamefully, sometimes even defiantly about her downfalls. That kind of raw honesty, though shocking in the early 1960s, is part of what keeps her memory alive today. She was in many ways ahead of her time, willing to bare her soul in an era that prized polished illusions. Her cautionary legacy fits into the broader tapestry of Hollywood folklore, the star with natural gifts who got lost in the labyrinth of fame, manipulative relationships, and personal demons. More than a few iconic actors and actresses have had similarly tragic trajectories, but Barbara's story is particularly stark. She went from having her name in lights to living on the edges of society in a matter of years. By the time she died, most of the glamorous illusions had long since fallen away. Even so, whenever people rediscover her story, they find echoes of perseverance and vulnerability. They see a woman who fought battles both external and internal. She lost many of those fights, yes, but she never completely surrendered her voice. And that resonates today, where there's far more open dialogue about addiction, mental health, and the price of unbridled celebrity. When you look at Barbara's life now, with the benefit of hindsight and a culture that's somewhat more empathetic to these issues, you can't help but wonder how differently things might have turned out for her if she had lived in a time with better support systems or more compassion for those in crisis. We might look back on Barbara Payton's life and think it was defined by scandal. But it might be more meaningful to remember the tender glimpses of compassion she was capable of. Those quiet moments feeding alley cats, or softly encouraging a waitress in the middle of the night, or speaking the unvarnished truth in an autobiography that stands as a testament to her humanity. She was, in many ways, an imperfect mirror of Hollywood itself, mesmerizing, flawed, fragile, and unforgettably real. And perhaps that's why, even decades after her passing, her name still sparks a poignant note among those who recall her era, or those who discover her story for the first time, and realize that behind the sensational headlines was a woman trying to find her place in the world. If you've stayed with me this long, I'd like to thank you for sharing in the memory of Barbara Payton. Feel free to add your thoughts, your recollections, or even your own stories of how Hollywood's golden age left its imprint on you. Our memories and reflections keep these figures from fading entirely into history. In remembering Barbara, we remember both the thrill of that old Hollywood magic and the steep price some paid for their time in the spotlight. Her story stands as a sobering reminder that stardom isn't merely about lights and cameras, it's also about the person behind the scenes, navigating the joys and sorrows of life, just like the rest of us, only with an entire world watching. And that wraps up today's video. If this video resonated with you, please give it a like, leave a comment with your feedback, and subscribe to stay updated on upcoming videos. Appreciate you watching.